Welcome to Dark Leaves Whisper, where people share the stories they never forgot, so the rest of us can hear them. Tell me where you're listening from in the comments. Subscribe if you want to hear more. And tonight, don't listen alone. I probably should start by saying that I don't think I was crazy. At least, I don't think I was. Nothing was wrong with me when I moved into that neighborhood. I wasn't drinking. I wasn't taking anything. I wasn't sleep deprived. I was working a normal job, paying my bills, and living a pretty ordinary life. That's why what happened bothers me so much. Because if somebody else told me this story, I'd probably have the same reaction everyone else had. I'd probably wonder what was wrong with them. I'd been living in the house for about 3 weeks when I met Frank. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was outside trying to figure out why one side of my lawn looked completely different from the other. I didn't know anything about grass. I was basically just moving dirt around and hoping it would fix itself. That's when I heard someone say, "You're going to kill it." I looked up. There was an older man standing on the other side of the fence, probably late 60s, maybe early 70s. Gray hair, thin face, one of those baseball caps that looked like it had been worn for 20 years. He was holding a garden hose. I laughed. "Yeah, I figured that out about 10 minutes ago," he smiled. "Too much water?" That was how I met Frank. He wasn't strange. That's probably the most important thing to understand. He wasn't pale or creepy or dressed like somebody out of an old horror movie. He looked like someone's grandfather. He talked slowly, but not unusually slowly. He complained about the weather. He talked about his tomatoes. He asked how long I'd been in the house. We talked for maybe 20 minutes that first day. Before I went inside, he pointed toward the lawn and said, "Don't water it again until Tuesday." I looked at the grass. "Tuesday? You'll make it worse." Then he went back to his garden. That was it. A completely normal conversation with a completely normal neighbor. After that, I started seeing Frank pretty regularly. Sometimes he would be outside when I got home. Sometimes he'd be sitting in a chair near the garage. Sometimes we'd talk through the fence while I was taking the trash out. It became one of those casual neighborhood friendships where you don't really make plans. You just happen to see each other. He learned what time I usually came home. He knew I worked late on Thursdays. He knew I liked coffee. I knew he hated the neighbor's dog because it kept digging under his fence. I knew he used to work with his hands, although I never actually figured out what kind of work he did. He never talked much about himself. Mostly, we talked about ordinary things. Gas prices, weather, the people who drove too fast through the neighborhood, the house across the street that had been sitting empty. Once, I mentioned that I was thinking about replacing the front porch light. Frank said, "Don't." I laughed. "Why? It's a good light." That was Frank. He always had an opinion about something. After a while, I started noticing the other neighbors. Not because they were friendly, because they kept looking at me. At first, I assumed they were just curious about the new guy. When you move somewhere, people notice you. I understood that. But it happened often enough that I eventually noticed a pattern. People would see me talking to Frank and then they'd look away. Not in a rude way, more like they didn't want to get involved. One evening, I was standing in the driveway talking to Frank about a broken fence panel. A woman from 2 houses down was walking her dog. She looked toward us. She slowed down. Then she kept walking. She didn't wave. Frank didn't seem to notice. Another time, I was talking to him outside while a couple across the street were unloading groceries. The husband looked over at me, then looked toward Frank, then looked back at me. I remember thinking, what's their problem? A few days later, I asked Frank about it. You think the people around here don't like me? He looked confused. Why would they not? I don't know. They keep staring. Frank shrugged. People stare. Then he changed the subject. I didn't think much more about it. Until one afternoon, another neighbor actually asked me something. I had just finished bringing groceries inside when a guy from across the street walked over. I'd seen him a few times, but we'd never really talked. He stood near the driveway. Hey, you settling in okay? Yeah, pretty good. He nodded. Then he asked, you know the people around here? I laughed. I'm getting there. He looked at the house next door. Good. I followed his eyes. Frank was standing beside the fence. I waved. Frank waved back. The guy looked at me again. Then he said, right, and walked away. I remember standing there thinking, that was weird. But not weird enough to mean anything. A week later, Frank told me about a storm that had happened years earlier. He said the neighborhood had flooded. I asked how long he'd lived there. He said, long enough. I laughed. That's not an answer. He shrugged. Maybe you'll find out. I thought he was joking. Looking back, there were a lot of things about Frank that didn't quite make sense. I didn't know enough to notice them. For example, I don't remember ever seeing him drive anywhere. I only remember seeing him when I was already outside. That didn't strike me as strange at the time. People have routines. Maybe he walked. Maybe he kept his car in the garage. There was always an easy explanation. Then came the day I realized something was wrong. It was a Tuesday. I'd gotten off work earlier than usual. When I turned onto my street, I noticed a moving truck. It was parked directly in front of Frank's house. I remember thinking, There were two people carrying boxes into the house. A woman, a man, and a little boy running around the driveway. I parked in front of my house and sat there for a minute. I honestly thought Frank had sold the place. That was all. I walked over. The woman noticed me. She smiled. Hi. Hey, you moving in? Yeah. She laughed. We're trying. I looked toward the house. So Frank finally sold it. She stopped smiling. Just for a second. Not dramatically. Just enough for me to notice. Frank? Yeah. She looked at her husband. Her husband looked at me. Then she said, I'm sorry. Who? I pointed toward the house. Frank, the guy who lived here. The couple exchanged another look. The woman said, we bought the house from the estate. I stared at her. Estate? Yeah. When did Frank move out? She hesitated. Well, and that's when I realized she didn't know who Frank was. She had never met him. She didn't know him. She had no idea why I was asking. And standing there in that driveway, I suddenly remembered something very specific. I had never once seen Frank walk through that front door. Not once. Not in 3 weeks. Not ever. I looked at the house. The same house I'd been staring at while talking to him. The same fence. The same garden. The same porch. And for the first time, I noticed something that should have bothered me a lot sooner. The house next door was completely empty. The curtains were gone. The furniture was gone. There weren't any photographs in the windows. It looked like nobody had lived there in years. But I had spoken to Frank that morning. I knew I had. I could still remember exactly what he said. He told me the weather was going to change. He told me my lawn looked better. And before I left for work, he'd said something that seemed completely ordinary at the time. See you when you get home. I went cold remembering it. Because now, I wasn't sure what he meant. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept telling myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe I'd misunderstood something. Maybe Frank had been related to the previous owner. The next morning, I asked the new homeowner about him. Frank? He looked confused. I don't know anyone named Frank. I reminded him what Frank looked like. He glanced at his wife. Then she said, "The realtor mentioned that name. He owned the house before?" "Before?" She nodded. "He died 5 years ago." I laughed because I thought she was joking. She wasn't. That was when I started remembering the little things. Frank never invited me inside. I never saw him drive anywhere. I never saw him walk into the house. Every conversation happened outside, usually when I was already outside. And the neighbors, they had always looked at me strangely. That afternoon, I asked an older woman across the street, "Did you know Frank?" She became quiet. Then she asked, "He spoke to you?" I nodded. She looked genuinely worried. "You should probably stop talking to him." That night, I stood outside looking at the empty yard next door. Then, I heard his voice. "Don't water the grass yet." I froze. It was Frank, exactly the same voice. But when I looked over the fence, nobody was there. The next morning, I found an old gray baseball cap on my porch. The kind Frank always wore. There was no note, nothing else. I turned it over. Written inside in faded black ink were 3 words. "See you Tuesday." It was Monday.
I used to think the strangest thing about my old apartment was the noise, not the neighbors. The building itself. It was an older 3-story building, nothing special. Brick outside, narrow hallways, old wooden floors that creaked whenever somebody walked across them. I lived on the 2nd floor. There was an apartment directly above mine. According to the landlord, nobody lived there. That didn't bother me at first. Lots of old buildings have empty units. The first time I heard someone walking around up there, I assumed maintenance was working. It was around 11 at night. I was lying in bed watching something on my phone when I heard it. One step, then another. Slow footsteps moving across the ceiling. I stopped the video. I listened. Step, step, step. Then a chair dragged across the floor. I thought, okay, somebody's upstairs. The next morning, I asked the landlord, "Hey, is someone moving into the apartment above me?" He looked confused. "No, I heard someone walking around." He thought for a second. "Probably pipes," I laughed. "Pipes don't drag chairs." He smiled. Old buildings make weird noises. That was it. I forgot about it. Until the next night. Same time. Around 11. Step, step, step. This time, it sounded like someone walking from one side of the apartment to the other. Then back again. I could actually tell where they were. Living room. Hallway. Bedroom. Then the sound stopped. I started noticing it every night. 11 o'clock. Almost exactly. Sometimes there were footsteps. Sometimes a chair moved. Once, I heard what sounded like someone dropping a glass. Then silence. I mentioned it to my neighbor across the hall. She laughed. "You hear it too?" That got my attention. "You've heard it?" She nodded. "Everyone does." I asked who lived upstairs. She shrugged. "Nobody," I laughed. "Seriously," she said. "Seriously." Then she went back inside. That should have been enough to make me uncomfortable. Instead, it became one of those weird things you get used to. Every night at 11. Footsteps. Furniture moving. Sometimes what sounded like someone humming. I never thought much about it. Until one night, The footsteps stopped above my bedroom. I was lying in bed. The sound had been moving around like usual. Then it stopped directly over me. I waited. Nothing. Then I heard 3 soft knocks on the floor. Knock! Pause! Knock! Pause! Knock! I sat up. A few seconds later, I heard footsteps moving away. The next morning, I told myself I'd imagined it. That afternoon, I asked the landlord if he would let me see the apartment upstairs. He looked uncomfortable. Why? I just want to see it, he shook his head. It's being kept closed. Why? He didn't answer. I pressed him. Finally, he said, there was a tenant there a long time ago. I asked how long. He said, before I owned the building. What happened to him? The landlord looked at the hallway. Then he said, he moved. That answer didn't sound right, but I let it go. A few weeks passed. Then one Friday night, something happened that I still can't explain. I was sitting on my couch when I heard the footsteps above me. 11 o'clock, same as always. But this time, the steps didn't stay upstairs. They stopped. Then I heard something I had never heard before. A door opening. I looked toward my apartment door. At first, I thought someone was entering my apartment, but the sound was above me. Then I heard footsteps coming down a staircase. Our building had no staircase directly connecting the apartments. There was only the main stairwell in the hallway. I opened my front door. The hallway was empty. I could hear someone walking. 1 floor above. Then my floor. Then closer. Step, step, step. I looked toward the stairs. Nobody. The footsteps stopped directly outside my apartment. I stood there holding the door. Nothing happened. Then I heard 3 knocks. Not on the upstairs floor. On my door. Knock! 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 I didn't open it. After a few seconds, the footsteps disappeared. I stayed awake until morning. The next day, I went to the landlord. I told him everything. This time, he didn't say pipes. He just stared at me. Then he asked, "What did the footsteps sound like?" I told him. He sat down. After a long silence, he said, "That unit has been empty for 19 years. I thought he was messing with me. Then what am I hearing?" He rubbed his face. "I don't know." I asked about the old tenant again. He finally told me the truth. A man had lived upstairs almost 20 years ago. His name was Daniel. He lived alone. Quiet guy. Kept to himself. One night, the landlord heard a loud crash upstairs. When he went up, the door was locked. Police came. They found Daniel inside. Dead. I asked how. The landlord said nobody ever figured it out. But before I could ask anything else, he said, the strange thing was that the apartment door was locked from the inside. I didn't like where the conversation was going. So I asked, "Why do you keep the apartment closed?" He looked at me. "Because every time somebody rents your apartment, they hear him." I stared at him. "You knew?" He nodded. "Most people leave." I asked why nobody told me. He said, "Because they wouldn't have rented it." I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because I couldn't believe the landlord was saying this so casually. I told him I was leaving. He didn't argue. That night was my last night there. I packed most of my things. I was planning to leave early the next morning. At around 10:30, I sat on the floor and waited. I wanted to hear the footsteps one last time. 11 o'clock came. Nothing. 11:10. Nothing. I started laughing at myself. Maybe the landlord had gotten into my head. Maybe the noises really were pipes. Maybe I'd spent weeks scaring myself over an empty apartment. Then, at exactly 11:17, step. I froze. Another. Step. Another. Step. The footsteps were moving across the apartment. Then they stopped. Silence. I waited. Then I heard the chair drag, slowly, across the floor, exactly like every other night. But this time, I noticed something. The sound wasn't above me. It was beside me. I looked toward the wall. The footsteps were coming from inside my apartment. I stood up. Another step. Behind me. I turned. Nothing. Then a man's voice quietly said, "Are you leaving?" I couldn't move. The voice sounded like someone standing 6 feet away. Not old, not distorted, just a normal man's voice. I whispered, "Who's there?" Silence. Then, "Good." I grabbed my keys. I didn't pack anything else. I walked out. I didn't even look back. The landlord was sitting in the office downstairs when he saw me. I told him I was done. He nodded like he already knew. I asked him one last question. Why does he walk around upstairs every night? He looked at me. Then he said something I wish I hadn't asked about. He doesn't. I stared at him. What? The landlord leaned back. We've always assumed the footsteps were him. He paused. But we've been wrong. I asked what he meant. He said, Daniel wasn't the person walking around upstairs. I waited. Then he said, Daniel used to complain about footsteps too. I didn't say anything. He continued. He told the previous owner that someone was walking around his apartment every night. My skin went cold. You're saying he heard it too? The landlord nodded. He thought someone was breaking in. I looked toward the stairs. So what happened? The landlord said, he stayed up one night waiting for them. And he heard the footsteps. I was barely breathing. Then the landlord looked directly at me. He opened his bedroom door. I waited. What did he see? The landlord shook his head. He never told anyone. Why? Because he didn't live long enough to. We stood there in silence. Then the landlord said, Daniel didn't die upstairs. I frowned. What? He died in his bedroom. My chest tightened. That's what I mean. He looked toward the ceiling. The footsteps weren't coming from his apartment. I didn't understand. Where were they coming from? The landlord looked at me. Your apartment. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed at a hotel. The next morning, I went back with 2 friends to collect my things. The apartment was completely normal. Nothing moved. Nothing missing. No strange sounds. I thought maybe I had finally gotten an answer. Then one of my friends stopped in the hallway. He looked up. Do you hear that? I didn't. What? He frowned, then smiled. Never mind. We finished packing. I left that building that afternoon. I never went back. A few months later, I started talking to the new tenant who moved into my old apartment. I didn't tell him anything. I figured there was no point. One night, he called me. He sounded annoyed. He asked, Did you ever hear someone walking upstairs? I didn't answer. He continued, It's weird. I asked, What does it sound like? He said, 3 steps. I felt my stomach drop. What else? He laughed, then said, Every night at 11. I hung up soon after. I thought that was the end of it. Until a few weeks later, I was staying at my new place. Different city, different building, completely different apartment. It was around 11 at night. I was lying in bed. The room was quiet. Then I heard it. A single footstep above me. I opened my eyes. Another. Then another. Step, step, step. I sat up. There was no apartment above mine. I live on the top floor. And that's when I finally understood something. Maybe the footsteps were never coming from the apartment above me. Maybe they were always coming from somewhere else. Maybe they were following me. And even now, some nights, just before 11, I hear someone walking across the ceiling. 3 steps, always 3. And every time it stops, I wait for the knock. Knock, knock, knock. I don't know if this is the kind of story that counts as a ghost story. Nothing ever chased us. Nobody screamed. Nothing jumped out of the darkness. There was no bloody face at a window or a shadow standing at the end of a hallway. It was just a sound. A small, familiar sound that I never thought twice about when I was a kid. And somehow, years later, That sound still bothers me more than anything else I remember from my childhood. Growing up, there was an old woman who used to walk behind our alley. She wasn't related to us. We just called her Granny. I don't even remember her real name. She lived somewhere farther down the block, and almost every afternoon she'd slowly make her way through the alley with an old metal walker. She was small, maybe in her 70s or 80s. She usually wore a cardigan, loose pants, and a little sun hat when it was warm. She had short gray hair and a smile that made her look much younger than she probably was. She was the kind of old person kids trusted. She never yelled at us, never complained when we were being too loud. If we were playing basketball and the ball rolled near her, she'd pick it up and toss it back. Sometimes she'd stop and ask what we were doing. Sometimes she'd ask whose house we were from. And if we'd been outside too long, she'd tell us, "Better get home before your mama starts looking for you." She always said it with a smile. But there was one thing that made Granny different. We could always hear her before we saw her. She had a little metal bell attached somewhere to her walker. I never knew why. Maybe it was supposed to warn people she was coming. Maybe it was part of the walker itself. Maybe she had attached it there years before. I never asked. Every time she took a step, the metal would bump against the frame. A soft little sound. Chunk, chunk, chunk. Slow, steady, always in the same rhythm. We could hear that sound from halfway down the alley. As soon as we heard it, somebody would say, "Granny's coming," and we knew exactly what they meant. Sometimes we'd wait for her. Sometimes we'd run toward her. Sometimes we'd keep playing and just wave when she passed. That sound became part of our neighborhood. You'd hear a dog barking, a screen door slam, someone yelling for their kids, and somewhere behind the houses, chunk, chunk, chunk. It was normal. It was comforting, actually. To me, anyway. Because when you're a kid, adults don't always feel predictable. They get angry. They get busy. They disappear into work. But Granny was always the same. Same smile. Same slow walk. Same little bell. Same three sounds. Chunk, chunk, chunk. Then one summer, she stopped coming. I don't remember the exact day. I just remember that we noticed. At first, nobody cared. We figured she was probably sick. Maybe it was too hot. Maybe one of her kids came to visit. Maybe she had gone somewhere. A few days went by. Then a week. We started talking about it. "Have you seen Granny?" "No, me neither," I asked my mom. She was washing dishes when I brought it up. "Mom, where's the lady with the walker?" She looked at me. "What lady?" "The little old lady that walks behind the alley?" My mom thought for a second. "Oh," I waited. Then she said, "She probably isn't feeling well." That made sense. So I forgot about it. Until a few days later. It was late afternoon. My brothers and I were outside near the alley. We were throwing a ball against the side of the garage, trying not to get yelled at. Then I heard it. Chunk, chunk, chunk. All three of us stopped. I looked at my brother. "Granny." Nobody answered. We just listened. Chunk, chunk, chunk. It was getting closer. Same rhythm, same pace. I remember smiling. We ran toward the alley to surprise her. I expected to see her rounding the corner. Maybe we'd scare her and make her laugh. But when we reached the end of the alley, nobody was there. The sound stopped. We stood there. My brother looked behind the fence. I looked toward the other end. Nothing. No Granny. No walker. No footsteps. Nothing. My youngest brother said, "Maybe she's hiding." We laughed. We searched around a little. Then we went back to playing. A few minutes later, we heard it again. This time from behind us. Chunk, chunk, chunk. We turned around. Nothing. The sound stopped. My brother said, "Okay." We stared at each other. He was still smiling, but not as much anymore. We went home before it got dark. That night, I asked my mom again, "Did Granny come by today?" She didn't answer right away. Then she said, No, I said. I heard her. Mom turned around. You heard what? The bell. She stared at me. What bell? I described it. The little metal sound from her walker. My mom dried her hands on a towel. Then she said, maybe you're hearing something else. I shrugged. That was the end of the conversation. At least, I thought it was. Because over the next few days, we kept hearing it. Sometimes in the afternoon, sometimes just before dark, once very early in the morning. Always the same. Chunk, chunk, chunk. Never faster, never slower, never more than 3 little sounds at a time. And every time we'd go looking, nothing. The strangest thing was that the neighborhood never seemed to react. Adults didn't come outside asking what it was. Nobody looked toward the alley. No dogs barked when we heard it. No gates moved. It was like the sound belonged there, like only we were bothered by it. One afternoon, I finally asked one of the older kids who lived nearby, do you hear that? He looked at me. Hear what? I waited for another sound. Chunk, chunk, chunk. He didn't react. I asked, the bell. He stared at me for a second. Then he said, you guys need to stop talking about that. I remember laughing. Why? He shrugged. Just do. Then he walked away. That made no sense. A few days later, my mom told me Granny had died. I was sitting at the kitchen table. She was making dinner. She said it very casually. Hey, that lady you were asking about, she passed away. I looked up. When? My mom gave me the date. It was several days before we heard the bell for the first time. I remember doing the math in my head. It didn't make sense. I said, no. Mom looked at me. Yes, I saw her. She shook her head. You couldn't have. I told her about the bell. She didn't answer. Then she said something that stuck with me. Don't worry about it. That was all. She didn't tell me not to go outside. Didn't tell me I was imagining it. Didn't laugh. She just said, don't worry about it. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about her, about the way she'd smile, about the sound, about the last time I'd thought we'd seen her. I remember asking myself whether I'd actually seen her then, or if I'd only heard the bell. I couldn't remember. That bothered me. The next evening, my brothers and I were outside again. Nobody wanted to admit we were waiting for it. But we were. The alley was quiet. The sun was going down. The shadows from the houses stretched across the pavement. Then, chunk, chunk, chunk. We all heard it. Nobody moved. The sound was coming from somewhere behind the fence. My oldest brother whispered, don't go over there. So we didn't. We stood there listening. Chunk, chunk, chunk. This time it sounded closer. Then it stopped. My youngest brother started crying. That was when we ran inside. We didn't tell our parents what happened. At least, not all of it. After that, the sound became something we never talked about in front of adults. It would appear once every few days, sometimes once a week. Sometimes we'd go for a long stretch without hearing it. Then, just when we'd forgotten, chunk, 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 it would return. Once, it happened while I was alone. I was sitting on the back steps, eating a popsicle. I heard the first sound. Chunk. I stopped eating. Then the second. Chunk. I looked toward the alley. The third came from much closer. Chunk. I dropped the popsicle and ran inside. I didn't stop until the door was locked. I never told anybody about that. For years, I thought that was the strangest thing that ever happened to me. It wasn't, because eventually the sound changed. One night, we heard the bell after everyone had gone to sleep. Chunk, chunk, chunk. My brother was awake too. We both sat in the dark listening. Then he whispered, "It's right outside." I didn't want to look, but I did. I walked to the window. I slowly moved the curtain. The alley was empty. The whole block was dark. No person, no walker, no movement. Then the bell sounded again. But this time, it came from directly underneath the window. Chunk, chunk, chunk. I jumped away from the glass. We didn't sleep that night, and neither of us ever looked out that window when we heard it again. Eventually, the sound stopped. Not gradually, it just stopped. One summer it was there. The next, it wasn't. Life went on. We got older. Our family moved. I stopped thinking about the alley. Then years later, I came back. I was visiting my hometown for a few days and decided to walk around the old neighborhood. Everything looked smaller. The houses, the street, even the alley. I stood there for a while, remembering things I'd forgotten. Then I heard something, a soft, metallic knock. I froze. I didn't move. Another. Chunk. I felt my stomach drop. Then another. Chunk, chunk. And finally the third. Chunk, chunk, chunk. Same rhythm. Exactly the same. I turned around. There was nobody there. I looked down the alley. Nothing. No footsteps. No walker. No old woman. Just the empty path behind the houses. I stood there for a long time. Then I heard a little girl's voice from somewhere nearby. Who's that? I looked over. A family was outside one of the houses. A little girl was staring toward the alley. Her mother called her inside. Come on. The girl looked back once. Then she disappeared into the house. I left. I didn't tell them what I had heard. And I never told my family either. Because what would I even say? That I heard the sound from a walker belonging to a woman who had died decades ago? That I recognized the rhythm? That somehow, after all those years, I still knew exactly what it sounded like? It doesn't make sense. That's probably why I still think about it. But there's one part of the story I never told anyone. When I was a kid, I thought Granny's bell always sounded the same because she walked the same way. I never questioned it. But standing in that alley as an adult, I realized something. That rhythm wasn't just similar. It was exact. The same three sounds, the same spacing, the same pause afterward, like it had been waiting there all those years. And just before I left that day, I heard it one more time. Only this time, it wasn't behind me. It came from the far end of the alley. Then it moved closer. Chunk. A pause. Chunk. Another pause. Chunk, chunk, chunk. I didn't turn around. I started walking. I could hear it following behind me. Slowly. Never getting faster. Never falling farther away. Just keeping the same distance. Chunk, chunk, chunk. I made it to the street. I kept walking. And just before I reached my car, it stopped. I never looked back. I still don't know whether it was really Granny. Maybe it was something else. Maybe a loose piece of metal was catching on the same fence every few years. Maybe my childhood memory turned an ordinary sound into something frightening. Maybe that's all it was. But sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I hear 3 little knocks somewhere in the distance. And without thinking about it, I count them. 1, 2, 3. Chunk, chunk, chunk. And for just a second, I feel like I'm a kid again, standing at the edge of that alley, waiting for Granny to come around the corner, knowing she's close, knowing she's walking toward me, and somehow never seeing her.